All right, so you're probably looking at all this back here, just disregard it because I want to talk to you about something that was brought to my attention. So I had someone ask me a very interesting question, and it made me take a deeper dive, and I want to kind of share this with you. If you find people who are moving in spaces where they realize that they move a little differently from you. When I went to school at the University of Tampa, one of the things that a lot of my classmates were enamored by was the routine that it took me to go back and forth from Tampa to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Now, you've got to keep in mind this context. For most of you, most of my classmates, a good portion of them were international students, or they lived in places like New York or Chicago and so forth. So for them, the normal mode of transportation was to fly. And so that was part of their norm. Me, at the time, part of my norm was to ride the bus. And it was interesting because when I was listening and talking to my classmates, they always kind of had this unique look on their face when they were like, so you really ride the bus, like bus. And I'm trying to get them to understand, yes, this was a part of my normal routine. I rode the bus. But it was interesting because I could still remember when a couple of my buddies wanted to go back with me because they were literally saying to themselves, we have to see what you experience. And it was interesting because I told them, I said, I have a routine for how I deal with riding the bus. And for those of you who are like, okay, I'm not understanding why the bus is such a big deal, especially if you've ridden a bus before. For me to get from my hometown, from Tampa, Florida to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, 24 hours, 24 consecutive hours. We're not talking a couple hours here. You stay at a hotel, get up the next morning and ride. 24 hours, 5 changes of the bus. And it was interesting because when they came to me and they were like, okay, we just want to see what this looks like. This is not comprehending. So it was funny because I can still remember going to the bus station, explaining to them that if you want to maximize this experience, you leave it the night and then you get there the next night. And of course, they just couldn't wrap their brain around that was actually a thing until they did it with me. And so when we got on the bus and we got to the bus stop and everything, all these things that I had to go through, they had to experience. Like you had to put your own luggage underneath the bus. No, there was nobody checking your luggage for you. You were basically, they take your stuff out of the bus and they would move it from when you were transferring buses. But effectively, your responsibility was to put stuff underneath the bus. At least it was during this time period. And so literally, we got on the bus at like 7 o'clock at night on a Friday night to be there for 7 o'clock Saturday night. And so it was funny because as soon as we got on the bus, the first thing I did was tell them, there are no assigned seats. You get a seat where you can get one. And I even had to explain to them what the routine was. I said, ideally, you want to have a seat close to the back or close to the front. Close to the back, because that's where the bathroom is, close to the front, so that when we get to stops, especially if you're changing buses, you can get off the bus quickly and not have to be bogged down by the people who are in front of you. But and when we got on the bus and the bus started, the first thing I did was sit down and I went to sleep. And it was funny because I remember one of them nudged me and said, wait a minute, you're going to sleep? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, that's it? Because remember now, we're talking around 1990, I think at the time. And at the time, there was no USB ports. There was no social media. There was no hotspots. Nobody had tablets or laptops or any of those things, or your cell phones. None of those things were there. So you literally were relegated to using things like, your Walkman and reading books. That was pretty much it. That was the only way you could entertain yourself unless you had somebody with you. And so they were just so enamored by this whole experience. Like, this is really a thing? And I'm like, yes, this is a thing. And so when we got on the bus, I told them that one of the ways you pass time away is you sleep. You're going to be on a bus for 24 hours. Even though you're going to change buses, the reality is that you need something to do to pass the time away. You can only listen to so much music. You can only read so much. So, and remember, we're starting at 7 o'clock at night. So invariably, at some particular point, you're going to fall asleep. So the ride is so much quicker when you're sleeping. But keep in mind, we had to change the bus. So we started in Tampa, changed in Tallahassee, changed in Montgomery, changed in Birmingham, changed in Memphis, and then stopped in Little Rock, where we got picked up in Little Rock and then driven another 30 to 40 minutes to my hometown of Pine Bluff. And it was wild because at each one of those vantage points, you got to keep in mind, you had to get off. It wasn't like you got off the bus, that bus refilled and you got back on again. That bus was going to every bus you took was going to another location after it followed on. So we were, you'd be on a bus 7 o'clock at night, you get comfortable at 11 o'clock, 11:30, almost midnight, you're pulling into Tallahassee. You'll go back to bed and sleep again. About 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, you're pulling into Montgomery. Next thing you know, about a couple hours later, it's 8, 9, 10 o'clock, you're pulling into Birmingham. Then 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours later, you're pulling into Memphis. This is probably around 1, 2 o'clock. Next thing you know, you're pulling into Little Rock. And keep in mind, we're also talking about the fact that there was all these micro stops along the way where they would pick up more passengers. And so when we did that experience, at each bus stop, you're basically getting off the bus, grabbing you something to eat, using the bathroom, getting back on. But the thing that was probably the most profound was when we actually got there. Because I told them, I said, listen, when you get there, we're going to get there at night. Trust me, you're not going to want to do anything. You're going to want to go to sleep and get up in the morning. We'll start rolling on Sunday. And again, they were just mind blown because, we're college kids. So we're used to, 7 o'clock, you rolling, 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, get out of here. But I had to explain to them that you don't realize how exhausting riding a bus is because you're literally changing locations. You're not sleeping consistently or eating consistently. It's breaking up along the way. So you're going to feel some kind of way when you finally get to your final destination. And so again, same thing. We got there at 7 o'clock and I still had to laugh because I told them, I said, yeah, we're not getting to my hometown till 8. And they're like, we still have a ride? I said, yeah. We could have taken the bus into Pine Bluff, but the layover in Little Rock would have kept us there for about 3 hours. So why do that when I can just have relatives come pick us up and call it a day? It was so amazing because when we got to Pine Bluff, which is about 8:30 that night, you can imagine exactly what I said. They were both exhausted, and so was I. And it was amazing because they looked at me and they were like, all they kept saying over and over again, this is what you do all the time. And I'm like, I don't do this all the time, but yeah, this is how I get back and forth between, Thanksgiving and Christmas and the end of the school year, beginning of the school year and things of that nature. This was it. They were so blown because they were like, why did you research it? And this is one of the things that I learned during this time period. A lot of times people don't understand what your norm is until they experience it. For them, their norm was to fly because they were in a position where, most of them, like I said, were international students. You're not riding a bus to the islands. But unfortunately, because that was their experience, they didn't have to worry about ever experiencing anything else until they saw mine. They had seen me, because at this point, if I remember correctly, I think I was a junior when this happened, when we did this trip. And so at this particular point, they had seen me do multiple trips like this. And the routine for all of us was pretty much the same, where effectively what would happen is, we would, at the end of the school year, whether it be the holidays or at the end of the school semester or so forth like that, all give up, dap up, and hey, number love for you, so forth, go our separate ways. Most of them would probably bump into each other at the airport because everybody's flying out. Me, when they left the campus, and I was an RA, so I usually was one of the last ones, I grabbed my duffel bag and my foot locker and I walked to the bus station. That was my norm. And it wasn't that I was thinking, I'm bored with me. No, I had found a routine that was consistent with how I could fund my education. At that particular point in time, I was so responsible for all of my financial responsibilities for the school that I didn't want to burden my mother. That was the first thing. And I did not want to do anything that was going to cause me any additional financial stress. This was something I knew. Now, don't get me wrong. I probably should have researched a little bit to see how much it was going to cost to fly. But in this particular instance, I had figured out the routine of riding a bus. There were no weight restrictions in terms of what you could bring. Because, when you fly an airport, you usually can only have a certain amount of pounds in your luggage. Me, I would bring back a foot locker full of school supplies that easily weighed 60 to 70 pounds. And so with the bus, there were no weight restrictions. You could bring 2 things to carry with you. So literally I brought my school supplies in my foot locker, and I had my duffel bag with literally all of my clothes. And so that mechanism worked for me. In addition to the fact that I was lucky because I also knew how to pay for the tickets and so forth. You could buy an open ticket. Like, to get an open ticket for an airline was very expensive because, they wanted to know when exactly you're going to fly for purposes of seats. Buses didn't have that hang up. So I could get an open ticket for $100, and that ticket would be for round trip, and I could go whenever I want to and whenever I came back. The reality is that it wasn't that I enjoyed riding the bus. Trust me when I tell you, it wasn't that. It's that I had found a routine that was consistent within the financial structure of me trying to survive going to college that worked for me, because no one was getting me a plane ticket or a train ticket or a bus ticket. I was getting this myself. And I had to factor in the fact of all these other things that went along with traveling. Because remember, in addition to all of the things that goes along with going to college, I also had to factor in, how do I survive getting back and forth? I didn't even think about that at first, about how to, because previously when I got to college my first year because I had a friend of mine who was going to college with me. But once he didn't come back, my responsibility, it fell on me to figure out, how do I get back and forth? And easily I could have turned to my family members, but I felt that this was my responsibility. And again, big part of being Generation X is that we were fiercely independent. So in my mind, I had convinced myself, if I chose to go to this college, then I am responsible for getting myself to this college. But what was wild was that so many of my friends did not understand what my norm looked like. So for them, on the outside, they see this kid with this 60-pound Foot Locker and a 20-pound duffel bag full of clothes walking to the bus station in downtown Tampa, and knowing that this is his reality and trying to process, how are you making this work? You'll find out that a lot of people, especially for those of us in Generation X, figuring out how to make these things work was just a part of the norm. And so for me, this was just part of my normal reality. And it was, like I said, I was so enamored by the number of friends of mine, number of classmates of mine who were really, I'm not going to say struggling. They just were just kind of blown away at at the steps that I had taken in order to make these things happen. But see, the difficult thing for them was they looked at this as a burden, as an inconvenience, as a struggle or strife. I looked at it as the norm because I predictably knew all aspects of the process. Weight of the luggage, time to travel, how long was I going to be on the bus, how much it was going to cost me. These things were all known things that I was aware of. Therefore, I wasn't shocked by the entire experience. Why am I stressing this? Because it's important to recognize that we often don't take stock for the fact that when people are dealing with challenges and adversities and trying to navigate them, they oftentimes try to figure out a manner that works and best for them, where they know all of the various factors, all the various variables, and all the various things that may come about in terms of anything that they may have to deal with. For me, this was a reality that I had become so comfortable with. I had dealt with all kind of weird things like this along these trips, that this was not something that I viewed as being not normal. So I can tell you, because I did have like I said, when my buddies rode back with me, I still remember when we got to Arkansas, they turned to me and they said, we never knew this was your reality. I mean, we knew that you rode a bus, but we didn't realize riding a bus meant all that. Like, it was like when they finally got a chance, and it was funny because when we got back to college, and fun fact, spoiler alert, we didn't ride the bus back. We actually flew back because it was in the midst of a strike. So it was all that going on. But it was funny because when we got back, I remember at least one of them was like, yeah, never going to ride the bus again. And the other one was like, Tony, you are crazy. There's no universe where the way you're doing things makes any sense whatsoever. But it made sense to me because guess what? I was at an affluent school. I was paying for my own education through college work study, RA grants as an resident assistant. I was on RTC scholarship. I had a leadership grant and some student loans. I was putting together this whole piece to make this a reality. And the last thing I was going to do was put myself in a position where I couldn't even get to the school. So if this gave me the ability to take care of it without having any added additional financial stress, this was a norm that I was okay. And the reality is that for me, I became okay with it because I knew this was my reality. So remember, and this is one of the things that we often don't talk about when we talk about people who are in the midst of challenging situations and facing adversity, or more importantly, those of us who find and look for normalizing ways of doing things that a lot of other people can't necessarily relate to. This was my norm. It may have been crazy, I ain't gonna lie, but it was my norm. And so when you run across somebody who has a norm like this, keep that in mind as well. Because again, all of these things were things that I felt that I had to do in order to make getting through and completing school a reality. I don't know if you know it, but there's always a background and a reason behind I do most of my stories or most of the content that I do. And if you want to know more about it, I got membership groups. Did you know that? And it has members only shorts or members only video, inside commentary, special behind the look scenes, all of these extra toys so that you can get an appreciation of what was the motivating factor behind the content I produce. If you ever watch my content and you want it more, this is for you.